COVID-19 remains a global health emergency, and I agree.
A rubber dinghy packed with African migrants reaching the shore of Zahara de los Atunes in broad daylight.
Why should this happen to people? Why should people die on the Mediterranean? Why should they die at borders? Why does border exist?
The battle along the front lines in eastern Ukraine is intensifying as Russian forces step up artillery attacks in the region.
Ya fue derribado un globo que fue hallado en el espacio aéreo estadounidense identificado como chino. La relación entre las dos potencias se sigue tensando.
We must not allow the world fall into another Cold War.
The desire to dominate the 5G industry and kill the prospects of your rival.
Inflation is dominating headlines in every corner of the globe. Now, from the Americas to Europe to Asia and Africa, prices of essential commodities, they continue to rise across the world.
193 millones de personas no tienen suficiente para comer cada día.
At the Bali Summit of 2022, the G20 addressed a situation of unprecedented complexity since its creation in 1999. When the world was coming out of the pandemic, the arrival of war in Ukraine, the rise of food and energy prices, the resulting food insecurity, and the worsening climate crisis was to top it all off. During the innumerable dialogues and ministerial meetings leading up to the Bali Summit, the G20 struggled to find a shared vision of current global challenges, mainly due to disagreements over the situation in Ukraine. Many doubt the G20's ability to articulate a common outlook on the immense challenges that the world faces today as it confronts geopolitical rivalries and increasing fragmentation alongside overlapping crises. The world is becoming more fragmented, less cooperative, more uncertain. We are navigating in more turbulent waters than ever before. Will this forum continue to be relevant in responding to the multiple global challenges, or will it sink into irrelevance until its dissolution? What role should emerging countries play at this international juncture?
We sometimes overlook the fact that the G20 has been one of the most important events regarding economic governance in recent decades. In fact, the incorporation of emerging and developing economies in the decision-making process for major global issues is now a reality. The G20 has evolved over the years in accordance with the changing concerns and priorities of leaders on global governance issues, from finance and international organizations to climate change mitigation. The advent of the G20 was a step towards a more plural world, the coexistence of different civilizations, a greater tolerance for diversity, a willingness to overcome frustrations in the search for consensus on various issues that emerged in a global and interdependent world.
We should start with the inception itself. The G20 had been established primarily to address challenges to international financial stability by the widening crisis in emerging economies in the late 90s. Considering the global impact of the crisis, the G20 recognized that this discussion needed to involve both advanced and emerging economies in order to make the international economic system more representative.
G20 emerged from the global financial crisis. Back then, EMEs and developed members embarked on the journey of macroeconomic policy coordination. Together, we saved the world economy from depression.
At the same time, a forum like the G20 is still defined in terms of a small group of countries, It doesn't seek to preempt or to overrule what happens at multilateral fora like the United Nations, but it enables those key economies to really get together and focus on global economic cooperation.
The first G20 Leaders Summit was convened by the then U.S. President George Bush in November 2008 to deal with the global financial crisis. Since its first meeting in Washington in 2008, this forum has been conceived as a space for international cooperation with the purpose of promoting economic growth and reforming financial systems in search of a better quality of life.
Developing countries are important sources of current and future supply and demand. They represent the market, promoting their integration into the global economy as a path of their prosperity is not just a moral obligation, it is absolutely essential for a sustainable and balanced growth of the global economy. That is the key. The emerging markets hold the key to the future, and therefore they need to play a very critical, a very crucial and a significant role in G20.
The G20 has evolved to become one of the most strategic international fora of global cooperation for developed and developing countries. We contribute permanently to shaping solutions to present and future systemic crises. The institutionalization of the G20 in 2008 at the leaders level was a clear recognition of the increasing economic and political relevance of emerging countries in the global economy.
The world has changed enormously since then. And today, emerging countries are in the position to represent the interests and aspirations of the Global South, and to help find solutions to problems that profoundly affect the inhabitants of this planet. To achieve this, it is necessary to sustain the support and increase the relevance of multilateral organizations.
The G20 defined itself then as a mechanism for economic coordination and by its own decision. Unlike the G7, which is an area of developed countries, the G20 is more representative of the current international political reality and can play an important role in addressing a series of global challenges as demonstrated by the COVID-19 pandemic, the change overcoming the environmental climate crisis, and the economic effects resulting from the situation in Ukraine.
Its inception indicated that the G7, represented entirely by the developed world, was actually insufficient in addressing cross-cutting global issues. It was imperative, therefore, to include middle and low-income countries and those with very systemic economic influence in the negotiations in order to find solutions which would be inclusive and effective.
The main difference between G7 and G20 is precisely the inclusion of emerging economies in a major leading platform of economic and financial cooperation. Unlike G7, which is a group of like-minded, similar advanced economies, G20 is a locus of a global dialogue of diverse countries. It's truly a pluralistic platform due to its diversity and its capacity to mobilize quickly and effectively.
Let me stress that coordination among EMEs is not forming a bloc versus our G7 partners, but to achieve a balance in G20 so that we could safeguard the interests of all G20 members. Our world is now faced with multiple challenges, including high inflation, food and energy crisis.
The G20 is not called upon to replace or renegotiate commitments assumed in other international forums. Instead, and to ensure results, its objective is to promote them through a show of political commitments to exercise their mandate, design concrete actions, and coordinate. Over the years, its agenda has expanded to other issues such as climate change, the environmental crisis, international trade, employment, empowerment of women, among others.
G20 has had a central role in conforming the international agenda. Today, G20 is the premier forum of economic cooperation, development dialogue. The most recent example of G20 ability to act swiftly has been the response during the pandemic, in which G20 took actions both to help the development and deployment of vaccines, medicines, and diagnostics, such as the ACT acceleration, and also to address the economic downturn caused by the pandemic and a series of crises, security and food crisis, for instance.
Shortly after the COVID-19 outbreak, EMEs pushed for G20 collective actions to catalyze global pandemic response. EMEs stand for development and progress. In G20, we always prioritize global development, inclusive growth, and global economic governance. Because of G20 process, the voting power of developing countries in the IMF and World Bank increased by 6 and 3.7 percentage points, respectively. EMEs stand by fairness and justice. To accommodate the concerns of EMEs, G20 agenda setting and decision-making are based on consensus rather than domination by a single country or group.
Firstly, the EMEs, the emerging market economies, are significant players in the global economy. Looking at the data from the period of 2011 to 2021, the EMEs' share of global GDP amounted to approximately 49.5%, with its share of global GDP growth reaching 67.3% globally. Now, since 2000, the MECs had recorded remarkable growth rates while keeping inflation and other potential problems largely under control. Even during the crisis of the global recession of 2007-2008, the emerging market economies bounced back and recovered better and faster than advanced economies. And they continue to play a big role in driving and affecting the global economy.
So you had an approach to crisis that ensured that the recovery is sustainable and also is broadly shared, and some countries don't recover at the expense of others. And you have cooperation between developing and developed country central banks in a way that you would not have had in the past. So in that sense, I would say emerging markets shape the agenda. If you look at another hot topic, climate change, we've been very clear that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities has to be reinforced and also backed by practical action. So commitments, for instance, to climate finance by the rich countries who are responsible for pollution, the G20 and the emerging markets within the G20 have been quite vocal in reminding the world of that obligation and also tracking to what extent that obligation has been met.
Changes in its structure have often been cited across the world economy. And in this sense, the G20 summits are viewed as an opportunity to reflect less focus on developed countries, incorporating the vision of emerging countries in a forum that outnumbers the G7. On the other hand, some opinions have held that the numerical advantage or the change in rhetoric towards emerging countries do not reflect reality, and that the agenda of the G20 continues to be dominated by the preferences of the G7, which would thus seal its policies, granting it a broader base of legitimacy and support.
But even when emerging market economies were formally at the G20 table, the menu, that is the G20 agenda, was still to a large extent designed in the way that did not reflect our interests and priorities on quite a number of issues, from reform of global governance institutions to climate and development agenda.
The leadership of emerging countries can contribute to achieving a better balance between the priorities of developed and developing countries. In previous years, there was a perception of predominance of major powers' agenda in the discussion. Unfortunately, the consequences of the pandemic and the current geopolitical tensions have had an important impact on multiple sectors. This crisis will continue damaging the progress of our development goals with long-lasting effects on the most vulnerable people.
EMEs have faced certain difficulties in imposing their agenda. This is coupled with a difficult outlook ahead. The World Bank itself recently warned about a worrisome scenario of overlapping crisis, which implies two grandee reverses, a step back in reducing global poverty after 3 decades, and an acceleration of inequalities.
To say we are falling behind on the Sustainable Development Goals on the 2030 agenda. We're not on track to meet most of those. Obviously, we can see challenges to food security. We can see challenges to access to energy. We see women have fallen behind in labor markets during the pandemic. So there's so many items on the SDG where we went with it with a lot of ambition, but now we have to make sure that we get back on track.
Much has been done over the past 14 years. Emerging market economies initiated the reform of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But while their quotas and voices have been eventually reviewed, the quota formula and the governance system of both organizations in general still deserve further reform. The G20 finance, development, climate and trade agenda has long been dominated by developed countries' approaches and needs, and it is the only in recent years, couple of years, that we have achieved a true balance of views in the G20 leaders' declarations. The Bali summit demonstrated that it is the emerging market economies who take a lead and safeguard the G20's role of a premier forum for international economic cooperation.
The G20 risks losing relevance as a primarily financial institution, considering that most of the dominating topics today are centered on geopolitics and security. In addition, a general governance gap is emerging across the global economy and the provision of public goods, given that large powers are consumed by geopolitical rivalry. The COVID-19 pandemic and now the conflict in Ukraine have instilled a sense of hopelessness, largely due to the wearing down, if not the lack of, international solidarity. And multilateral organizations have been highlighted, especially for a lack of adequate response.
As recently demonstrated by positive outcomes of the Bali summit last November, the role of emerging countries was key to reducing geopolitical tensions between big powers. Our commitment to international peace, stability, and prosperity has been confirmed with the adoption of a sound and robust G20 Leaders Declaration. Diplomacy and dialogue must always prevail.
In this context, we hope that EMEs will stand together and work together for a stronger G20, for more inclusive and world economic recovery and sustainable development.
Until now, the G20 agenda has primarily focused on the problems of the developed world rather than on the specific, urgent challenges of emerging economies and developing countries. However, in the years to come, the successive presidencies of India, Brazil, and South Africa can launch a new perspective that prevents the agenda of this international forum from being reduced into a mere recycling of the one won by the G7.
The Troika, followed by the South African presidency, will provide G20 the unique opportunity to look at development from the perspective of the developing countries whose share in global market is growing and expanding. And that would turn the tables in many ways so that we can have a very fruitful discussion on issues concerning both the developed and the developing world.
Having the presidencies being held by the emerging market economies clearly means that we are able to set the agenda for the work and priorities of the G20, especially in support of the developing countries. You can see this clearly reflected in our team, the Indonesian presidency team and priorities, which we have set out, which is recover together, recover stronger.
To achieve these goals, emerging market economies must not only voice their views, but be active and persistent in promoting them. It means to be at every table and form the menu ourselves. It also means to bear responsibility for those emerging market economies and developing countries who are not at the G20 table, to involve them in G20 work, to get engaged with them.
I take great courage from the fact that India has invited Nigeria, Egypt, Mauritius, might be missing, and obviously Bangladesh and others outside the African continent. But just when we look at the African invitees, we're seeing a greater voice for the continent in the G20, which has also been an important issue for us as South Africa, that we don't want to be the only ones around the table.
When India takes over the presidency, it is not speaking the voice of India alone. It's speaking the voice of the Troika, it's speaking the voice of the emerging markets. It's speaking the voice of also the global South. The emerging economies leading the multilateral forums actually allows us to make a case for global South-sensitive globalization. It is a model of globalization that shifts from a self-centered to a human-centric approach.
The Brazil G20 presidency in 2024, starting December 2023, will be an opportunity to bring to the center of the agenda areas that are important to us, such as sustainable development, energy, climate, social inclusion, and sustainable infrastructure.
So, the coming Troika opens an unprecedented continuum of emerging countries at the helm of the forum that could, at long last, shift world attention to the needs of countries in the global South. With this, we will take a big step to be able to generate consensus and face the different problems that await us in this uncertain world.